My name is Alan, and I thought after 25 years of marriage I understood the woman I shared my life with. I was wrong. One evening, as I passed my son-in-law's house, I spotted my wife's silver Lexus parked at his gate. That sight alone rattled me, but what I overheard inside shattered everything I believed about love, loyalty, and family. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a conspiracy worth millions plotted against me by the two people I should have trusted most. What they didn't know was that I held the one piece of evidence that could destroy their entire scheme. This is the story of how the man they called a fool turned their game upside down. Before we begin, I'd like to ask, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories. I never imagined a single glance at a driveway could alter the course of my entire life. But that's exactly what happened. As I slowed my car near my daughter's house, I caught sight of something that made my stomach clench: my wife's silver Lexus parked boldly at the gate. That car was supposed to be in our garage, not sitting in front of my son-in-law's home. For a moment, I convinced myself it was harmless. Maybe Margaret had dropped something off. Maybe she was helping Brianna with errands. But the longer I stared, the heavier the suspicion grew in my chest. Something about the scene felt wrong, painfully wrong. I parked down the street, killed the engine, and walked back on shaking legs, careful to stay in the shadows. The April air was brisk, yet sweat gathered on my forehead as I approached the side window. From behind the curtain, I heard voices. One of them was unmistakably hers. "When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for." Her voice. My wife of 25 years. The words sliced through me like a rusted blade, cruel and cold. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I gripped the window frame just to keep myself from collapsing. She wasn't laughing with an old friend or sharing idle chatter, she was conspiring. And then another voice joined hers, one I recognized instantly: Dan, my son-in-law. Their tones were low, conspiratorial, dripping with contempt for me. Dan was laying out legal steps as if it were a well-rehearsed strategy session. File in June claim irreconcilable differences, and according to Iowa statutes, Margaret would be entitled to half of everything: my business, my properties, even spousal support for life. He spoke about my construction empire like it was a prize waiting to be claimed. Margaret giggled, a sound I once adored, now turned venomous. "The man actually believes I love him," she said. I pressed closer to the glass, trembling but refusing to move. I pulled out my phone, fumbling to open the recorder, desperate to capture every word. For months, while I'd been sweating through 16-hour days to keep payroll steady, they had been planning my ruin. Every bank statement, property deed, and contract I trusted Margaret with had been copied, cataloged, weaponized against me. My pulse thundered so loud I worried they'd hear it. And then fate nearly betrayed me. A twig snapped under my foot. I froze, pressing against the brick wall as both of them fell silent. "Did you hear that?" Margaret whispered, a sharp edge in her voice. Dan brushed it off, but my heart hammered as I held my breath. For 15 minutes I stood there recording every poisonous word, until I knew enough to understand the truth. My marriage, my family, my very life had been nothing more than a setup. When I finally slipped back to my car, the world I thought I knew was gone. Let me ask you this. If you overheard your spouse plotting to destroy everything you built, what would you do? I sat frozen in my car, hands locked around the steering wheel, as if letting go would shatter me completely. The Lexus gleamed in the driveway behind me, silent proof of the betrayal I had just witnessed. My keys dangled uselessly from the ignition, the faint metallic rattle the only sound in a world that suddenly felt hollow. 5 minutes earlier, I had called my daughter Brianna, eager to surprise her with dinner plans. She had answered cheerfully, "Sorry, Dad, I'm not home. Dan's there working on case files." That lie, so casual, so unassuming, echoed now with sickening clarity. She hadn't known. My wife had used my daughter's home as the stage for her conspiracy. I stared at my reflection in the windshield. The same face that had risen before dawn for decades. The same hands that had built coal construction from a single truck and a set of borrowed tools. The same man who thought he had a loyal partner by his side. Margaret's laughter still rang in my ears. 2 years of playing the devoted wife. Every anniversary, every kiss goodnight, every whispered, "I love you" in the dark, had been a script. A performance designed to lull me into blindness. Anger surged hot in my chest, but alongside it was something colder, sharper resolve. My phone was still recording every word captured in crystal clarity. That folder on the coffee table, bank statements, property deeds, valuations, wasn't just paperwork. It was evidence of how far they had gone to strip me of everything. They thought I was naive. They thought I would never question their sudden interest in finances, their hushed conversations, or their convenient explanations. The front door creaked open, jolting me from my thoughts. Margaret stepped out her designer handbag, swinging casually at her side, her face composed as though she hadn't just mocked her husband's very existence. Dan followed, straightening his tie with that smugness I had always despised, but tolerated for my daughter's sake. When Margaret's eyes landed on me in the driver's seat, her composure cracked for the briefest moment. Shock registered like a slap. "Alan," she stammered, her voice an octave higher. "What are you doing here? 25 years of marriage had taught me how to mask my emotions, but now I used that skill in a way she'd never anticipated." I forced a weary smile. "Just finished a site inspection nearby. Thought I'd stop and see Brianna." My lie rolled smoothly, though my pulse hammered like a drum in my ears. Dan moved closer to her, his body language protective, suspicious. His pale gray eyes studied me, looking for cracks, for proof I had seen or heard too much. "She's not here," Margaret said quickly, too quickly. "I was just helping Dan organize some legal documents for a client." The ease with which she lied made bile rise in my throat. How many other lies had I swallowed without question? I chuckled lightly, as if unconcerned. "Oh, I thought you'd be at work until 6 today. Didn't you mention something about the Henderson proposal this morning?" Her face faltered, panic flashing for just a second before she recovered. "I left early. Headache." I nodded as if satisfied, but inside I felt the tide shift. They believed their deception was intact. What they didn't realize was that I had just turned their entire scheme into my weapon. "So let me ask you, would you confront them then and there, or would you wait, gather more proof, and strike when they least expected?" I drove away from Brianna's house with my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The neighborhood blurred past, but my mind replayed every poisonous word I had captured on my phone. For 25 years, I had trusted Margaret with my heart and my home. I had put her name beside mine on deeds, accounts, and investments. Now I understood why she had been asking more questions about my business, why she had suddenly cared about balance sheets and project contracts. She hadn't been interested in supporting me, she had been gathering ammunition. When I pulled into our driveway, the manicured lawn and fountain she had demanded for our 20th anniversary felt like props in a cruel play. I sat there for a long time, staring at the house I had built with my own hands. Every beam, every nail, every corner had been a testament to my love for her. Now it mocked me. She hadn't seen it as love. She had seen it as leverage. Inside the house was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret wasn't home yet, but her presence clung to every room. The wedding photo on the mantel caught my eye December 15th, 1987. She looked radiant in ivory silk. I looked proud, awkward, and hopeful. Back then, I believed her laughter was genuine. Her hand in mine, a promise. Now I wondered if that moment had been the start of a performance that lasted a quarter of a century. I walked through the living room, past Brianna's childhood pictures, past the shelves I had built while Margaret was pregnant, and collapsed into my old leather recliner. She had always hated that chair, saying it was too ugly for the formal room. But it had been mine, the one place I could rest after 16-hour days. Now it was the only seat in the house that didn't feel tainted by her lies. I closed my eyes and thought about the conversation I had overheard. The man actually believes I love him. Those words echoed louder than any construction site I had ever worked on. Did she ever love me? Or had she simply waited until my empire was strong enough to take for a moment grief almost broke me? But then something shifted. I hadn't built coal construction by being weak. I hadn't survived recession's labor strikes and competitors by giving up. If Margaret and Dan thought they could play chess with my life, they were about to learn that I was no pawn. I was the builder of the board itself. I pulled out my phone and replayed the recording, making sure every word was captured. Their arrogance was my weapon now. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed strategy. I thought of all the men I'd seen broken in court, stripped of businesses and dignity because they reacted in anger instead of planning in silence. I wouldn't be one of them. By the time I stood up, the grief had hardened into something colder. I would smile at Margaret across the dinner table. I would nod at Dan if we met in passing. But behind that mask, I would be calculating every move. Tell me if you were in my shoes. Would you let them think they were winning while you prepared the final blow? The next evening, Margaret walked through the front door at her usual hour, carrying that leather handbag I'd seen swinging casually outside Brianna's house. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and launched into her routine chatter about errands and neighbors. If I hadn't stood outside that window, I might have believed her. But now every word felt rehearsed, every gesture a performance. I matched her smile, nodded in all the right places, and kept my voice even. She couldn't suspect I knew the truth, not yet. Over dinner, I studied her like I had studied blueprints my whole career. 25 years of marriage had made me fluent in her moods, but tonight I saw them differently. Her laughter was too polished. Her questions about my day too careful. When she asked if payroll was difficult this month, I remembered Dan's voice boasting about documenting assets for months. I pictured the manila folder on Brianna's coffee table and nearly lost my composure. But I forced myself to stay calm. Confronting her now would hand her the advantage. She'd spin lies faster than I could untangle them, maybe even turn Brianna against me if I wasn't careful. No, I had to let her think she was still in control. Later that night, when she retreated to the bedroom early with a claim of a headache, I sat alone in my office, surrounded by the files I had accumulated over 3 decades. Tax returns, contracts, partnership agreements. Every piece of paper Margaret and Dan thought they had stolen or copied, I had the originals. They were building their case with smoke, while I held the stone foundation. Still, I couldn't shake the image of Dan's hand resting on the small of her back, that casual intimacy he'd displayed, as though he had already taken my place. I gripped the edge of my desk until my knuckles turned white. For years, I had tolerated him for Brianna's sake, dismissing his arrogance as youthful ambition. Now I saw him clearly, a man who built nothing, who latched onto others' work, feeding like a parasite. Around midnight, I heard Margaret moving upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing. Perhaps she was gathering documents to deliver to him. Perhaps she was texting him, planning their next step. I sat in the darkness, forcing myself not to storm up the stairs. Instead, I picked up my phone and checked the recording once more. 43 minutes of venom preserved like a weapon waiting to be drawn. The irony struck me. Margaret thought she was the actress hiding her betrayal behind a mask. But now I was the one performing. I was the devoted husband, the patient listener, the provider. She would never suspect I had already crossed the threshold from victim to strategist. As I finally turned out the office light, one thought anchored me. She believed I was blind. But in truth, I had never seen more clearly in my life. So I'll ask you, if the person you trusted most was secretly your enemy, would you reveal your hand, or would you wait until the stage was set for their downfall? The days that followed were a strange theater of pretense. Margaret carried on as if nothing had changed, leaving lipstick-stained coffee mugs in the sink, humming while she folded laundry, even dropping kisses on my cheek, as though affection still lived between us. I mirrored her act, answering questions with the same warmth I had offered for decades, even teasing her gently the way I used to. But beneath my calm exterior, my mind was sharpening like a blade. Every word she spoke, every glance at her phone, every unexplained errand became a clue in the puzzle of her betrayal. I had always thought of myself as a builder, not a fighter. But as I replayed the recording late at night, I realized that building and fighting weren't so different. Both required patience, vision, and a steady hand. Margaret and Dan thought they were architects of my downfall. What they didn't understand was that I had been designing structures to withstand storms my entire life. Their scheme would crumble the same way a poorly laid foundation collapses under pressure. One evening, as she complained about the price of groceries, I nearly laughed. Just days earlier, I had seen the evidence of nearly $50,000 siphoned into accounts under Dan's name. Did she think I was blind to the contradictions? She leaned across the table, brushing my hand with hers, and asked sweetly if I could show her the new business valuations I'd been working on. I smiled, swallowed my disgust, and promised I'd share them later. Of course, later never came. At work, I kept my usual schedule, but every free moment was spent planning. I pulled files from storage, scanned old contracts, and called on contacts who owed me favors. My office transformed into a war room, columns of notes on yellow legal pads, asset lists, leverage points. The sound of construction crews outside the hum of machinery grounded me. Out there, things were built with steel and sweat, not deception. In here, I was preparing to defend what I had built, with the same principles: strength, endurance, and precision. One night, Margaret returned home later than usual. She smelled faintly of Dan's cologne, a detail she probably thought I wouldn't notice. She offered some excuse about meeting an old friend from her book club. I nodded, hiding my fury, but the mask slipped just slightly when I asked her a simple question. Did you enjoy your book discussion? For the briefest moment, panic flashed across her face. Then she recovered, rattling off a title so quickly it was clear she hadn't thought it through. That was the moment I knew my performance was working. She was the one starting to sweat. As I lay awake that night, listening to the sound of her breathing from the other room, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving her betrayal anymore. I was preparing to turn it against her. She believed I was still the trusting husband. But in truth, I had already begun the counterattack. And here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever stayed quiet, letting someone think they were winning, while deep down you were planning their downfall? I woke the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt since the day I started my business. Betrayal had burned away the last traces of grief, leaving only focus. If Margaret and Dan thought they were the only ones capable of strategy, they were about to learn how wrong they were. My first move wouldn't be anger or confrontation, it would be control. Quiet, methodical, legal control. I called Marcus Webb my accountant and friend for more than a decade, a man who had steered me through recessions and tax audits. Marcus, I said, steady but sharp. It's time we reviewed every account. I want safeguards on everything. There was a pause, then his calm voice. You've never called me with that tone, Alan. Tell me what's going on. I gave him only the surface details, enough for him to understand urgency, but not enough to expose my personal humiliation. He didn't need to know Margaret's laughter still rang in my ears at night. What mattered was tightening every bolt before my enemies knew I was moving. By noon, I was in his office, combing through documents, restructuring ownerships, reinforcing barriers. Offshore arrangements that Margaret didn't even know existed were secured, and trust protections were set in motion. For years, she'd been cataloging the visible wealth house's cars accounts in both our names. What she didn't know was that the crown jewels were hidden behind walls she could never breach. The next step was more direct. I drove to First National Bank and sat across from Tom Bradley, the bank president, and my golf partner of 15 years. The smell of coffee and leather in that mahogany conference room was familiar, but this meeting was different. Tom, I said, sliding a folder across the table, I want every joint account frozen until further notice. Access only with dual verification and every credit line requiring my signature. He studied me carefully. Alan, this is going to cause friction at home. I let a smile play at the corners of my mouth. That's the point. Tom nodded, no further questions asked. Loyalty built over decades of trust was worth more than any piece of paper Margaret thought she owned. By the time I left the bank, the locks had been changed, figuratively speaking. Margaret's credit cards, her precious emergency fund, even the account she used for club lunches, all suspended. She wouldn't find out until she tried to spend. And she did. At precisely 12:03 p.m., as I reviewed blueprints at the construction site, my phone buzzed with the first declined transaction. By 12:50, she was calling me in a panic. Alan, something's wrong with our accounts. My card was declined. They said there's a security hold. Do you know anything about this? I almost laughed at the perfect innocence in her tone. Security hold, that sounds serious. Did they say what triggered it? She huffed about embarrassment at lunch, about friends watching her fumble with a useless card. For once, she was the one explaining herself while I stayed silent. That was the moment I knew the balance of power had shifted. She thought she was cornering me with paperwork and betrayal, but I had just taken away her favorite weapon, money. So tell me, if you had the chance to flip the game quietly, would you pull the trigger or wait to let them squirm? I've always said you learn more about a person when they're embarrassed than when they're angry. And Margaret proved me right that afternoon. By 2 o'clock, I had received no fewer than 6 text messages and 3 voicemails, each one more frantic than the last. The woman who once strutted through Riverside Country Club like royalty was suddenly reduced to pleading over a declined credit card. The funniest part was how predictable it all was. Margaret lived for appearances. Lunch with her friends at the club wasn't just about food, it was theater. The handbags, the whispers, the carefully curated stories of vacations and purchases. That was her kingdom. And I had just pulled the rug out from under her in front of her entire court. When my phone rang again at 2:23 p.m., I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. Alan, she hissed, her voice low but edged with panic. Tom Bradley's secretary said he's in meetings all day. I can't reach him. This is humiliating. Do something. I leaned back in my chair at the job site trailer, listening to the roar of machinery outside. Margaret, I'll make a call tomorrow. These things happen. Probably just a glitch. I could practically hear her grinding her teeth through the phone. A glitch, Alan. I couldn't even pay for my own lunch. She hung up in frustration, and I let the silence wash over me. For years, I had been the one scrambling, rushing to cover bills, working overtime to fund her latest whim, enduring her sighs when I said no to a new car or another trip. Now she was the one scrambling, and it tasted like justice. But Margaret wasn't the only one rattled. My investigator, Mike Rodriguez, called me just before 4. "Alan, your son-in-law's been busy. He tried to access the joint account 3 times this afternoon. When that didn't work, he went after your daughter's education trust fund. That one's frozen too, per your instructions. He's angry, made a scene on the phone with the bank." I chuckled, a sound that surprised even me. Good. Let him feel what it's like to be powerless. Mike hesitated. "Alan, men like him don't stay powerless long. He'll push back maybe harder than you expect." I knew he was right. Dan wasn't just a greedy parasite. He was a lawyer trained to twist narratives and manipulate systems, which meant Margaret's embarrassment was just the opening act. They would regroup, reframe, and come after me with something sharper. Still, for that one afternoon, I allowed myself the luxury of satisfaction. Margaret wanted to play the victim. She could start by explaining to her friends why she couldn't buy a $20 salad. Dan wanted to posture as a brilliant attorney. Let him explain to Brianna why he couldn't move a dime from an account. As the sun set over the job site, painting the cranes and steel beams in gold, I realized this was only the beginning. I had drawn first blood, and they would retaliate. But I wasn't the same blind husband they thought they were up against. And let me ask you, if someone betrayed you for money, would you savor their first stumble, or would you already be planning the next strike? By the time the sun dipped behind the horizon that evening, I knew Dan would already be scrambling. Men like him, overconfident, entitled, but drowning in quiet debts, don't handle disruption well. Sure enough, my investigator Mike called just after dinner. His tone carried a trace of satisfaction. "Alan Thompson's been making calls all afternoon. 3 subcontractors, 2 banks, and even the State Bar Association hotline." He's spooked. I leaned back in my recliner, the same chair Margaret used to call an eyesore, and smiled faintly. "And what did you find?" Mike's report was damning. Dan owed nearly $180,000 in student loans, carried an $8,500 a month office lease he could barely afford, and had developed a reputation for cutting corners with client funds. Subcontractors whispered that he promised payment one week, then vanished the next. 2 ethical complaints had already been filed with the bar, both dismissed for lack of evidence, but the stains remained. The picture was clear. Dan's life was built on image, not integrity. A glass tower with cracks running through every floor. Margaret saw him as her ticket to independence and wealth. In reality, he was a drowning man clinging to her like driftwood. I imagined the scene at his office papers, strewn across his desk phone, pressed to his ear, sweat on his brow, as he realized his safety net had vanished. He had counted on Margaret's access to my accounts. He had built his grand strategy around money that was never truly his. Now, with everything frozen, his empire of arrogance was collapsing. Margaret, of course, tried to soothe him. I could picture her perched on his sofa, manicured nails, tapping the armrest, whispering promises of patience. She had always been skilled at convincing men they were stronger than they were. I had once believed her too, but I knew Dan's type. Fear would gnaw at him until it drove him into mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what I was waiting for. At home, I kept my mask firmly in place. Over dinner, Margaret asked casual questions about payroll contracts and whether I'd thought about updating our estate plan. I stirred my soup slowly, careful to hide the fire burning inside me. "I've been considering it," I told her evenly. "Might be time to review everything." She smiled faintly, not realizing she had walked straight into the trap I was already setting. Later that night, as I replayed the recording once more, I thought about how often betrayal hides behind the language of love. The man actually believes I love him. Her words had seared themselves into my mind, but now they didn't cut as deeply. Now they were evidence proof of intent, motive, and deception. I whispered into the silence of my office as if speaking to them both, though they couldn't hear me. You thought I wouldn't fight back, but I build for a living. And I'm about to dismantle everything you've created. So let me ask you, if you discovered your enemy's entire foundation was already cracked, would you wait for it to collapse on its own? Or would you deliver the final blow yourself? The call came late in the afternoon, just as I was reviewing bids for a new medical center project. My phone buzzed with Brianna's name, and for a moment my chest tightened. She was my only child, my pride, and in this storm of betrayal, I worried how much she knew, or worse, what she might already believe. "Hey, sweetheart," I answered, forcing warmth into my voice. Her tone was cautious, deliberate. "Dad, I need to ask you something. Is everything okay between you and Mom?" The question hit me harder than a hammer to the ribs. "Why do you ask?" I managed. She sighed, the kind of sigh that carried both concern and frustration. "There's been tension. Mom seems stressed about money. And Dan, he keeps asking me odd questions about your company. Things like how the partnerships work, who controls which accounts. It feels like they're fishing for information." "What's going on?" I gripped the edge of my desk. So Dan had tried to drag my daughter into his scheme, using her psychology training, her instincts against me. "Probably just curiosity," I said evenly. "You know your mom, she likes to understand security when things get complicated." Maybe she replied, but her voice carried doubt. "Dad, if something was really wrong, you'd tell me right." The silence between us stretched. What could I say? That her mother was planning to gut our family's foundation, and her husband was the architect of the plan. That 25 years of what she thought was love was nothing but rehearsal for betrayal. No father wants to destroy his daughter's world in one conversation. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, finally steady but evasive. "Everything's fine. Just business stress. You don't need to worry." But Brianna wasn't convinced. "I've seen patterns like this before, Dad. Clients who hide things until it's too late. Please just promise me you're protecting yourself." Her words lingered long after the call ended. She didn't know the half of it, yet her instincts were sharper than she realized. She was already doubting her mother's narrative. And that gave me hope. That night at dinner, Margaret tried to keep the illusion alive. She laughed about the neighbors, complained about the grocery store, even reached for my hand across the table. I smiled back, but my thoughts were with Brianna. I knew sooner or later she'd demand the truth, and when that moment came, I needed to be ready. Later, in the quiet of my office, I pulled out the recording again. Every venomous word Margaret and Dan had spoken was preserved on that file. Evidence, proof, the kind of truth even a trained psychologist like Brianna couldn't ignore. I whispered to myself, almost as a vow, when the time comes, she won't have to choose between love and loyalty. She'll have the truth, and the truth will set her free. So let me ask you, if your own child started to see through lies, would you reveal everything at once, or would you wait until they asked for proof themselves? For 3 days straight, my home office transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet room filled with neat filing cabinets and old photographs became a command center. 2 laptops hummed on my desk, their screens glowing with spreadsheets, bank records, and property deeds. Yellow legal pads covered every surface, scrawled with columns labeled assets, weaknesses, leverage, timeline. To anyone else, it would have looked like chaos. To me, it was order, my blueprint for survival. Every night I shaved, carefully wore my best navy suit, and slipped on the reading glasses Margaret once said made me look distinguished. It wasn't vanity, it was ritual. Preparing myself mentally for the battle ahead. I wasn't the grieving husband anymore. I was the builder of my own defense. Marcus, my accountant, visited on the second day. He shook his head as he flipped through the offshore accounts we had secured years ago. "Alan, you're lucky you planned ahead. Most men in your situation wouldn't stand a chance." I nodded, though luck had nothing to do with it. Hard work, foresight, and 35 years of building had given me more than money. They had given me armor. But Margaret and Dan hadn't been idle either. Through Mike, my investigator, I learned about their frantic meetings. Dan tried to access accounts called creditors, even attempted to shuffle money from Brianna's education fund. Margaret, meanwhile, had been whispering to her friends, planting seeds of doubt about me, claiming I was controlling, paranoid, even abusive. The irony nearly made me laugh. I'd spent my life providing everything she ever demanded, only to have my generosity twisted into chains she claimed to resent. Still, I stayed silent. Let them think their plan was working. Let them believe I was the clueless husband too proud to notice. They had no idea that every lie they told, every desperate move they made, I was documenting. Not just for myself, for the day this would all be laid bare. One night I pulled out the wedding photo from 1987. There we were, Margaret glowing in silk, me looking awkward in my rented tux. For years I'd thought of that photo as the start of our story. Now I saw it as the first act of a performance. I set it down carefully, then placed the recording device beside it. Past and present side by side, the promises of love and the proof of betrayal. By the third evening, as I reviewed contractor testimony about Dan's unpaid debts, I felt something new, calm. Not resignation, not rage, but clarity. I had the evidence, I had the allies, and I had the patience of a man who'd built skyscrapers one brick at a time. When Margaret kissed me goodnight that evening, I smiled back, hiding the storm behind my eyes. She thought she was playing me like a fool, but I had already drawn the blueprint for her downfall. And I want to ask you, if you had the power to end a betrayal, would you strike quickly, or would you wait until every piece was in place, so the collapse was complete and irreversible? The first counterpunch landed on a Saturday morning. Mike, my investigator, called just after sunrise. His voice was steady, but the words hit like a hammer. "Alan, your wife and son-in-law met late last night at his office. They're shifting gears. If they can't get to your money directly, they're going to paint you as abusive." I sat at the kitchen table, the morning paper spread untouched before me. Abuse. The word itself carried a weight heavier than any financial accusation. In a small town, reputations weren't just important, they were everything. I had built mine over 35 years of honest work contracts, honored paychecks delivered. And now the two people I had once welcomed into my home were planning to twist my entire life into a weapon against me. Mike continued, his tone clipped professional. "They're rehearsing a story. Margaret as the terrified wife, Dan as the legal mastermind who swoops in to protect her. They're planning to use the frozen accounts as proof that you're financially controlling her. And if that doesn't stick, they'll escalate emotional abuse, intimidation, maybe even stalking claims." I leaned back slowly, letting the information settle. It was bold, almost reckless. But I should have expected it. Men like Dan, women like Margaret, they never admitted defeat. They turned generosity into evidence of manipulation and love into chains. That evening, I kept my face composed as Margaret returned home. She set her handbag down, sighed dramatically, and sat across from me at the dining table. "Alan," she began softly, "I think something's wrong with us. You've been distant, controlling. Her eyes shimmered with manufactured tears, the kind I had once believed. I folded my hands and gave her a small nod. Marriage has its ups and downs. She looked surprised at my calmness, but pressed on. You froze the accounts without asking me. I couldn't even pay for lunch yesterday. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? I kept my voice even. Security measures, Margaret. Nothing more. But inside, I recognized the rehearsal. Every word she spoke wasn't meant for me. It was practice, the first draft of the victim story she'd tell a judge, a jury, maybe even our daughter. Later that night, I replayed the recording I had of her and Dan, her mocking laughter filling my office once more. The man actually believes I love him. That line had once been a knife. Now it was a shield. If they wanted to spin a story, I had the truth on my side. Still, I knew how dangerous this next phase would be. Lies spread faster than facts. A whisper at the country club, a rumor at church, an insinuation at the Chamber of Commerce dinner. It didn't take much to corrode a man's standing. Margaret's power wasn't in evidence. It was in performance. As I shut off the light and headed to bed, one thought steadied me: if they wanted to turn my love into a crime, I would let them build their case. And then, at the right moment, I would bring the hammer down. Tell me, if you knew your enemies were about to lie to the world about who you are, would you fight the rumor immediately, or would you wait until the lies reached their loudest point before silencing them with proof? It didn't take long for Margaret to make her move. By Sunday morning, she had arranged a brunch with Brianna at their favorite cafe downtown, a place they'd shared mother-daughter mornings for years. Mike had tipped me off the night before. He'd overheard her calling Dan, whispering that she was going to test the waters with our daughter. I knew exactly what that meant. She was going to plant her victim story, hoping to wrap Brianna's loyalty around it, before the truth had a chance to surface. I wasn't there at the cafe, but Mike had a contact in the building next door. Through thin walls and a vent system older than either of us, he relayed every word. Brianna Margaret began her tone, soft, trembling, just enough to sound rehearsed, but not desperate. I think something's wrong with your father. He's been controlling lately. He froze all our accounts. I couldn't even buy lunch. It's frightening. My daughter, steady as ever, set down her coffee cup. I could picture her clinical expression, the one she used with difficult patience. Mom, financial restrictions can mean different things. Sometimes it's abuse, but sometimes it's just asset protection during business changes. What explanation did Dad give you? Margaret faltered but recovered quickly. He said it was security. But you know your father. He can be paranoid. I think he's trying to punish me. Brianna leaned forward, her voice calm but precise. Punish you for what? Silence stretched before Margaret spoke again. Maybe because I've been questioning the marriage. Maybe because I've thought about divorce. That was her mistake. Brianna wasn't a child anymore. She was a licensed psychologist, trained to spot manipulation. Mom, she said carefully, are you asking me for psychological insight, or are you asking me to take sides in a conflict? The bluntness of that question rattled Margaret. Mike told me her hands fidgeted, her eyes darted, the act slipping. I'm asking you to help me understand what's happening to our family, she said finally, but even through a vent system, her voice sounded hollow. Brianna didn't relent. As a psychologist, I can tell you major behavioral changes don't happen in a vacuum. Something must have triggered Dad to lock down finances. What happened right before he did that? Again, silence. Margaret had no answer she could give without exposing herself. She shifted back to feigned vulnerability, but the damage was done. My daughter wasn't buying it. When Mike relayed this to me that evening, I sat in my office with my hands folded, the recording still secure in my drawer. Margaret had tried to weaponize our daughter, But instead, she had only sown more doubt about her own honesty. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself a flicker of pride. Brianna wasn't just my daughter. She was sharper, stronger, more discerning than Margaret ever realized. So let me ask you, if someone you loved tried to pull you into their lie, would you play along to protect them, or would you confront the truth head-on, no matter the cost? The following night, Margaret's Lexus wasn't in our driveway until nearly 10. I knew where she had been. Dan's office lights had burned late, and Mike had parked across the street watching. By the time she slipped through our front door, her perfume carried the faintest trace of his cologne, a detail she probably thought I would miss. I didn't ask where she'd been. I didn't need to. Mike had already filled me in. She and Dan had spent 2 hours crafting their next move. They're done with patience, he reported over the phone. They're going nuclear. Dan's filing for emergency divorce proceedings on Monday morning. Claims of financial abuse, immediate spousal support, restraining orders, the works. I let out a long breath. So the real war was beginning. Freezing the accounts had rattled them. Now cornered and desperate, they were preparing to weaponize the courts. It was reckless, but not unexpected. Dan was a lawyer who believed procedure could cover for a rotten case. And Margaret, she had always believed performance could substitute for truth. Mike continued, his tone sharp. Alan, you need to be ready. They'll flip the narrative. You'll be the controlling husband, the paranoid tyrant. Every act of generosity, every vacation, every house, every car will be painted as manipulation. They'll claim you built dependency to control her. I stared out the office window at the home I had built with my bare hands in 1995. A fountain Margaret had insisted on sparkled under the porch lights. Now it felt less like decoration and more like evidence she'd twist into a chain. I whispered to myself, they think they can turn love into a crime. That night at dinner, Margaret played her role perfectly. She wore a soft cardigan instead of her usual designer armor, no jewelry except her wedding ring, which suddenly gleamed brighter than ever. Alan, she said gently, I hope you know how much I appreciate everything you've given me. I wish we could talk more about money, about our future. I feel shut out sometimes. Her voice trembled on that last line, and I almost laughed. She was rehearsing again, testing lines she'd use in front of a judge. I offered her a kind smile, masking my revulsion. We'll talk soon, Margaret. I promise. After she went to bed, I replayed Mike's words in my head. Emergency filings, abuse allegations, restraining orders. They were planning to paint me as a monster, and they would do it publicly. But what they didn't know was that monsters rarely keep records. I had 43 minutes of their voices plotting, mocking, scheming. When the time came, their lies would crumble under the weight of their own words. For now, I stayed quiet, patient. In construction, rushing a foundation always led to collapse. Better to let them lay their false groundwork brick by brick until I could topple the whole structure in one decisive strike. So let me ask you, if you knew your enemies were building a case of lies, would you dismantle it piece by piece, or would you wait until the final moment to reveal the truth and bring the entire house down? The call came on a Tuesday evening, sharp and direct. Brianna's voice carried none of her usual warmth. Dad, I need to see you. Tonight. No excuses. There was no mistaking the urgency, so I told her to meet me at my office. By the time she walked in, the sun had dipped behind the horizon, leaving the glass windows of Cole Construction glowing with the reflection of streetlights. She closed the door behind her and sat down across from me with a determination that made my chest tighten. Dad, she began, folding her hands like she was in session with a patient. Mom's been pressing me. She says you're controlling, paranoid, even abusive with money. Dan keeps asking about the structure of your company, who owns what, who controls which accounts. I need to know the truth. What's going on? Her words were clinical, but her eyes searched mine with a daughter's desperation. I had rehearsed this moment in my head for days, but when it came, it was harder than I expected. Protecting her from the truth had been instinct, but hiding it any longer would only let Margaret and Dan twist her further. I leaned forward, my voice steady. Brianna, you asked for the truth. I'm going to give it to you. But once I do, there's no going back. She nodded. I can handle it. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolled to the recording, and hit play. Margaret's voice filled the room, smooth and venomous. When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for. Brianna stiffened her fingers, tightening together. She listened silently as Margaret mocked our marriage, as Dan outlined his legal strategies, as they calculated every dollar of my empire like vultures dividing a carcass. For nearly 40 minutes, her face remained composed, but I could see the storm building behind her eyes. And then came Margaret's cruelest line, God, the man actually believes I love him. Brianna flinched. The mask cracked. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was heavier than any courtroom I had ever stood in. Finally, she whispered, How long have you known? 6 days, I said. I overheard them at your house. I've been planning my response since. Her voice trembled, but not from weakness. Rage simmered beneath it. She asked me to assess you, Dad. She wanted me to use my credentials to call you abusive, to turn me into her weapon. I reached across the desk, resting my hand over hers. I'm sorry you had to be dragged into this. I never wanted you to carry this burden. But Brianna shook her head, eyes blazing. Don't apologize. I know where I stand now. I choose truth over loyalty. Mom and Dan are liars, and I won't be their accomplice. Relief coursed through me, tempered by sorrow. She had chosen me, but it meant losing her mother and her husband in one stroke. I saw the pain in her eyes, even as she stood with resolve. Before she left, she turned at the door. Dad, when the time comes, I'll testify. Not as your daughter, as a professional. They won't win. So let me ask you, if your child uncovered betrayal from both a parent and a spouse, would you urge them to forgive, or would you tell them to fight for the truth, no matter the cost? Brianna's key turned in the lock at precisely 7:30 that night. Dan hadn't expected her home so early. He was sprawled across the couch, legal documents scattered on the coffee table, a half-empty whiskey bottle within reach. The arrogance I'd seen in him so many times was still there, shoulders loose, feet kicked up, but beneath it, tension simmered. He looked up, startled, when she entered. We need to talk. Brianna announced, her tone crisp. She set her purse down with deliberate precision, like a judge setting the gavel. Dan reached for his whiskey glass, trying to mask his unease. Rough day, he muttered. The Barrett deposition got postponed again. Clients are impossible. I know about the conspiracy, Dan. Her words cut the air like a blade. He froze, the mask slipping off his face in an instant. What conspiracy? The one where you and my mother plotted to financially destroy my father while using my psychology credentials to sell false abuse claims. I heard the recording. Every word. Dan's eyes flicked to the scattered documents on the table, then back to her. He set the glass down carefully, as though precision could buy him time. Brianna, I think you're misunderstanding. That was strategy talk, nothing serious. 25 years of playing the devoted wife, she snapped, quoting Margaret's line verbatim. Sound familiar? The color drained from his face. Dan Thompson, the attorney who could spin circles around a jury, suddenly looked like a man stripped bare. How much did you hear? Everything. The timelines, the asset division, the mockery of my father's trust. You plan to use me, Dan, my career, my reputation, my love. She remained standing while he shrank into the cushions, whiskey forgotten. For the first time, he wasn't the predator, he was cornered. Brianna, listen, he tried again, his voice rising with desperation. I did it for us. For our future. Your dad's empire. Our future, she interrupted, her voice sharp. You call conspiring with my mother against my father our future. You call turning me into a weapon, love. The silence after her words was suffocating. Dan rubbed his temples, his composure unraveling. It was just business, business. Brianna's laugh was bitter hollow. Marriage isn't business, Dan. Family isn't business. You crossed a line you can't come back from. She walked to the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the closet, and began packing. Each folded blouse, each pair of shoes slid into the case with deliberate finality. Dan followed, panic creeping into his voice. Wait, Brianna, don't do this. We can fix it. We can spin it. She turned to him, her eyes cold. I'm done being spun. Our marriage is over. When she left that apartment 20 minutes later, suitcase in hand, Dan was still standing in the doorway, calling her name. But Brianna didn't look back. She was no longer his wife, no longer his pawn. She was her own woman, angry, heartbroken, but free. So let me ask you if your spouse betrayed not only your trust, but also your family. Would you give them another chance? Or would you walk away without ever looking back? The Davenport County Courthouse smelled of old wood and disinfectant, a scent I'd come to know from years of contract disputes and zoning hearings. But this morning was different. This wasn't about a business deal or a construction bid. This was about my life, my marriage, my reputation, my legacy. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed as if she had studied the part of a battered wife. A plain dress replaced her usual designer armor, minimal makeup softened her face, and she held a tissue in her hand like it was a prop. Beside her sat Linda Hawthorne, a divorce attorney known for her scorched earth tactics. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered with her usual no-nonsense demeanor, gavel striking like thunder. Mrs. Cole, she began. You allege your husband has engaged in financial abuse and intimidation. Please describe specific incidents that led you to fear for your safety. Margaret lowered her eyes, voice trembling. For months, Your Honor, my husband has restricted my access to our accounts. He watches my spending questions. Every purchase makes threats about what would happen if I tried to leave. Last week, he cut me off completely. I couldn't even buy groceries, the courtroom murmured. To an outsider, it was a convincing performance. But I sat calmly, hands folded, waiting. When the judge turned to my attorney, James Morrison, his expression was steady, seasoned. Your Honor, he said, we have evidence that Mrs. Cole's claims are not only false, but part of a deliberate conspiracy to defraud my client of marital assets. Linda bristled. Objection. James held up a hand. We have audio, Your Honor. A 43-minute recording of Mrs. Cole and her co-conspirator Daniel Thompson discussing exactly this strategy. The judge's brow furrowed. Proceed. James connected his phone to the courtroom's audio system, and Margaret's voice filled the chamber. When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for. The words echoed like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Margaret's face drained of color, her tissue crumpled in her hand. Linda whispered furiously in her ear, but there was no salvaging the moment. The recording continued, Dan laying out legal maneuvers, Margaret mocking my devotion, their laughter sharp and cruel. God, the man actually believes I love him. At that, the judge's gaze hardened. When the audio ended, the silence was heavier than steel beams. Judge Hendricks leaned forward. Mrs. Cole, do you have any response to this evidence? Margaret's mouth closed, then opened again. No words came. Linda stood pale. Your Honor, I request permission to withdraw as counsel. I was not informed of these circumstances. Permission was granted. Margaret sat alone, exposed, the mask ripped from her face in the most public way imaginable. I should have felt triumph, but instead I felt something colder, sadder. A recognition that the woman I had loved for 25 years had become nothing more than an actress caught mid-performance. So let me ask you if the person who betrayed you was humiliated before the world. Would you feel satisfaction, or would you feel the heavy ache of what was lost? The moment the audio ended, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Margaret sat frozen, her tissue shredded to confetti in her trembling hands. Linda Hawthorne, once so confident, whispered something sharp before rising to request her withdrawal. The judge granted it without hesitation, and suddenly Margaret was alone at the plaintiff's table. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was judgment. Every pair of eyes in that room saw her for what she was. Judge Hendrick's voice cut through the air like a blade. Mrs. Cole, your petition for a restraining order is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for review of possible perjury charges. The gavel cracked. Margaret flinched as though struck. I should have felt triumph, but what I felt was clarity. The performance was over and she no longer had a script. She turned toward me, eyes wide with desperation, searching for some trace of the man who once forgave her late arrivals, her careless spending, her lies. But I wasn't that man anymore. Dan's downfall came almost as quickly. 2 rows behind Margaret, he sat with his own legal pad trying to appear detached, professional. But the whispers had already spread. The state bar investigator seated in the back had heard every word of the recording. By the time court adjourned, Dan's phone was buzzing with calls he couldn't ignore. 3 clients withdrew representation within the hour, citing ethical concerns. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp, the April wind cutting against my skin. Reporters swarmed, microphones flashing. I said little, just that I trusted the legal system and was grateful the truth had been heard. Margaret, by contrast, rushed through the crowd, her face hidden behind sunglasses, muttering no comment, as the cameras captured every step of her retreat. That evening, I received a call from Jim Morrison, an old colleague who still sat on the Chamber of Commerce board. Alan, I just want you to know the community's behind you. We've all seen what she did. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone. The support steadied me, but I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Margaret's social circle, the country club wives who once envied her handbags and vacations, had already begun closing ranks against her. Invitations vanished. Calls went unanswered. She had built her world on appearances, and now that facade was crumbling faster than Dan's legal reputation. At home, I walked through the quiet rooms of the house I had built, pausing at the mantel where our wedding photo still stood. I picked it up, studied her younger face, the bright smile that once felt so real. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. She had traded love and loyalty for greed and performance, and in the end, she had nothing to show for it but ashes. As I set the photo back down, I whispered to myself, "The truth always outlasts the lie. So let me ask you, if the truth finally cleared your name, would you stand tall in victory, or would you grieve the years wasted on someone who never truly loved you?" The courtroom humiliation was only the beginning. Within 48 hours, Dan's carefully crafted facade of competence began to collapse. The State Bar Association, already suspicious of his handling of client funds, wasted no time after hearing the recording. A formal letter landed on his desk demanding a full accounting of all trust accounts from the last 18 months. For a lawyer, that was the equivalent of a guillotine being sharpened. Mike, my investigator, called me with updates I almost didn't need. Alan Thompson's office looks like a crime scene. Boxes of files everywhere, his secretary crying at her desk. He's been on the phone non-stop trying to buy time. But the bar's not playing games. They've already subpoenaed his bank records. I pictured him pacing his office, pale-faced, sweat soaking his collar, realizing that the very tactics he had once used to corner others were now turned against him. It was poetic justice. Clients began fleeing the moment news broke. Morrison Industries withdrew a $200,000 retainer. Chen Plumbing canceled their contract. By Thursday afternoon, half his caseload had evaporated, leaving only debts and unpaid invoices in its place. The whispers spread quickly through the legal community. Thompson had been caught manipulating client funds, and worse, conspiring with his own father-in-law's wife. Even in a world accustomed to scandal that was unforgivable. Brianna, meanwhile, had wasted no time filing for divorce. She stopped by my office, crisp and resolute. "Dad," she said, "I spoke with my attorney today. I'm done with him. Papers will be served this week." Her voice didn't waver, but I saw the shadow of grief in her eyes. She hadn't just lost a husband. She'd lost the man she thought she had built a future with. "I'm proud of you," I told her. "You're stronger than either of them ever realized." That same night, Margaret called Dan from the parking lot of a country club that had just revoked her membership. Mike caught every word. "Dan, they're cutting me out. Everyone knows. You promised me we'd win this." His voice was ragged, stripped of its usual smugness. "Do you understand what I'm facing? Disbarment, Margaret. Jail, maybe. You think this was just about you? My career is over for once." Margaret didn't have an answer. By Friday morning, the bar had scheduled an emergency hearing. Mike was there to observe, slipping me updates in real time. "Alan, it's bad. They've got contractors lined up testifying about unpaid invoices. One of them said Thompson lied about settlement funds for months. The panel isn't buying his excuses." I leaned back in my chair, letting the news settle like a slow sip of whiskey. Dan Thompson had built his reputation on intimidation and smoke. Now the smoke was clearing, and all that remained was rot. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace creeping in. Justice wasn't always swift, but it was thorough. And now it had found him. So let me ask you, if you saw the person who tried to destroy you losing everything they once held dear, would you celebrate their fall, or would you simply nod and let justice run its course? If Dan's collapse was professional, Margaret's was social. For a woman like her, that was a slower, crueler death. By the weekend, the whispers had reached every corner of Riverside Country Club. The women she once dazzled with handbags and vacations now turned their faces away. At Sunday brunch, she approached Linda Patterson, her bridge partner of 5 years. Linda busied herself with her eggs, Benedict refusing to look up. Susan Morrison excused herself for a sudden phone call. Even Janet Crawford, who once hung on Margaret's every word, offered only a brittle smile before sliding her chair back. Margaret's world was built on appearance, and appearances had abandoned her. She tried to cling to what remained. At home, she dressed as if nothing had changed, silk blouses, heels clicking against the hardwood floors I had laid myself in, 1995. But the phone stayed silent. Invitations stopped arriving. She no longer had a court to rule. One evening, she confronted me in the kitchen. Her face was painted with the remnants of a mask she no longer believed in. "Alan, they've turned on me. The club, the charities, even the garden committee. Everyone's whispering." I leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Maybe they heard the truth, Margaret." Her eyes flashed a mix of anger and fear. "You don't understand. They were my friends." "No," I said softly. "They were your audience. She recoiled as though struck. For years she had measured her worth in the eyes of others, and now those eyes had closed. Meanwhile, I attended a Chamber of Commerce board meeting that same week. When asked about Margaret's absence from the annual fundraiser, I kept my tone calm, even sorrowful. Sometimes I told them, you discover people aren't who you thought they were. After 25 years of marriage, I found out she was planning something against me. It's painful, but I'm grateful the truth came to light. Heads nodded, sympathy in their eyes. In business, honesty counted more than appearances. My reputation remained intact, even strengthened, while hers crumbled. By Thursday, Margaret was uninvited from the charity board she had once chaired. By Friday, she received a formal letter reviewing her country club membership, and by Saturday, she walked into the mall where she once shopped without blinking at price tags. Only this time she wore a name badge and worked behind a counter. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mike Everblunt told me he'd seen her that afternoon. She looked smaller, Alan. Not in size, just in presence. Like someone who's been stripped of everything that gave her weight. I thought about that long after he spoke. Margaret had once been radiant, yes, but it was a radiance powered by what she could take, not what she could give. Without the stage, without the audience, she was just Margaret, an aging woman who traded loyalty for ambition and lost everything in the bargain. So let me ask you, if the person who betrayed you lost the very world they worshipped, would you pity them? Or would you believe they finally received exactly what they deserved? The house felt different once the storm had passed. For months it had carried the weight of lies, every corner echoing with rehearsed laughter and whispered phone calls. Now silence filled it, but it wasn't the hollow silence of betrayal. It was the quiet of peace. I could sit in my recliner without wondering where Margaret was or who she was with. I could walk past the fountain she'd once demanded for appearances and see it only as water glinting in the sun, not as a monument to her vanity. For the first time in years, the house belonged to me again. Cole Construction, too, stood stronger than ever. The community had rallied around me when the truth came out. Clients who once hesitated now signed contracts with firm handshakes, telling me they respected the way I had handled myself. You didn't shout, Alan, one contractor said. You let the truth speak. That mattered in my line of work. Reputation was steel. You either forged it carefully or let it rust away. Margaret, on the other hand, was left with rust. Her attempts to recover socially went nowhere. By summer, she was working retail at the same mall where she once bought handbags that cost more than my first truck. I passed her once, unrecognized by the younger women behind the counter who treated her like any other clerk. She saw me, though. Her eyes widened for a moment, then dropped. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Dan's fate was harsher. The state bar stripped him of his license after uncovering $127,000 in misused client funds. Word spread quickly, and he fled town to take a paralegal job in Nebraska. From attorney to assistant in less than a year, the fall was as complete as it was deserved. Brianna, though scarred by the betrayal, had begun rebuilding her own life. She filed for divorce and started a new practice focused on family therapy. If I can help one person recognize manipulation before it destroys them, she told me then, maybe something good came out of this. She was stronger than either of them ever realized, and I couldn't have been prouder. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows I had installed myself decades ago, I sat in the living room and let it all wash over me. Margaret had been right about one thing. I really had believed she loved me. But now, with the evidence clear and the mask stripped away, I understood the difference between love and performance. Love endures through storms. Performance crumbles the moment the lights go out. As I looked around the home I had built, I didn't see loss anymore. I saw survival. I saw truth. and I saw a man who had walked through betrayal without letting it break him. So let me ask you, when the lies fall away and the dust settles, is reclaiming your peace the sweetest revenge of all? Looking back, I realize betrayal doesn't just strip away trust. It tests the very core of who you are. Margaret and Dan believed they could reduce my life to numbers on a page that love and loyalty were nothing more than assets to divide. But the truth has a way of cutting through lies, and when it finally did, their empire of deceit collapsed under its own weight. I won't pretend the journey was painless. Losing a wife of 25 years and watching my daughter's marriage unravel cut deep. But what survived was stronger honesty, dignity, and a bond with my daughter that no lie could sever. She chose truth over loyalty to deception, and in doing so reminded me that character will always outlast performance. If you take one lesson from my story, let it be this: protect your peace as fiercely as you protect your wealth. Money can be stolen, reputations can be attacked, but integrity, once proven, becomes your strongest defense. And if you're a parent or spouse tempted to manipulate those who love you, remember, no scheme built on betrayal ever ends in victory. Have you ever lived through a betrayal like mine? How did you handle it, and what did you learn from it? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening.